Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to pick up on some thoughts expressed by former Labour Minister and now peer Andrew Adonis. He argues that we are likely to see the extension period effectively carry on, but with the language changing. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So before I begin, there's a few things that the government may be planning to do when it comes to Brexit. There was quite an interesting piece in the Financial Times, but I think I want to discuss that tomorrow. I'm going to focus on this one today. Now, before I explain the main thrust of what is a credible argument in some ways, I will need to point out that it all makes perfectly logical sense, to a point, but we currently have a government that does not always follow logic. So beware of assuming that Boris Johnson has any plan at all. But if he does, this could be it, or part of it, to essentially agree to what he will call a deal with the EU that is actually just the transition period on terms very similar to what we have right now. Now, before I go over the reasoning, this would be potentially plausible, but for one major sticking point that I'll go over later. For now, suffice to say that if we arrange an agreement that has exactly the same terms as right now, then there wouldn't need to be an implementation period as such. There'd be nothing to actually set up. As such, you could keep pretending to play hardball with the EU all year and then spring into action in October, making it seem that indeed the EU had backed down because all of a sudden you've got this deal at the end of the year. And there'd be time for it to be ratified as well. So the logic runs as follows. We can't physically cope with a no-deal scenario. Even the government have given up pretending to be able to do so last week, and it said that it wouldn't be able to carry out customs checks on incoming agricultural goods from the EU. But, as I've noted myself, that leaves you in quite a difficult position because you aren't allowed to just not check and apply tariffs to EU goods, but then still do all that to US goods, Chinese goods from anywhere else. So if you don't apply tariffs to EU produce, then you have to cancel it on all the rest. Now, that could be done. The government could just make a decision not to apply tariffs on any incoming goods, but that would mean that in the mother of all economic disasters, we are collecting even fewer taxes needed for already ailing public services. And it also makes it impossible to negotiate trade deals with anyone. Because after all, if we don't apply tariffs or checks on goods coming into the country, which would be bloody good for smugglers, what are you going to offer another country in a trade deal? It's like you go to a country, it doesn't matter if it's Japan or the EU or anyone, Australia, and say, we'd like a free trade agreement. We'd like you to not apply tariffs to our goods. To which they will say, okay, what are you going to give in return? You can't say, well, we won't apply tariffs to your goods, because they'll say, well, you're not doing right now. We have nothing to offer. Oh, and those countries therefore will be applying tariffs and quotas to our goods. Of course, they have to, because they don't want to cancel tariffs and quotas on all of the goods as well. It makes a mockery of their own trading agreements. So we can't apply checks. We can't physically apply checks. We've spent years, the Conservative government has spent years not putting anything in place. They should have been working on these systems from 2016. They didn't. So now we can't. We haven't got time. We can't do that. But we also can't not apply checks and tariffs either. It's a classic Brexit catch-22, isn't it? So if we can't apply checks to EU goods, then we need a system that allows them to legally come into the country with the current system of checks that we can implement. That means we need to retain access to the single market, adopting the current customs arrangements and signing a binding agreement to this effect to allow this to happen legally without the US, China and other countries throwing a wobbly. So, on to how this can be done. I mean, we could extend the transition period. Never mind all the guff about legal blocks on doing so after this month. Legislation doesn't apply to parliaments that don't like it. The British and EU parliaments could easily agree to amend the law and go for the extension even quite late in the day. Not right at the end, but fairly late in the day. However, Boris Johnson has put himself in a position where to do so would be politically impossible. So, unless there was a major panic on the part of backbenchers at the end of the year, I cannot see it happening. But you can't rule it out completely, but the chance is very, very low. 2, the other option, which is what Andrew Adonis is suggesting, is that Boris Johnson agrees to what is effectively the transition period, but as a separate treaty. So it will essentially be exactly the same as the transition period, maybe one proviso. It'll just have a different name. So, you just sign it as if it's a different treaty. And what he suggests is, given that the Brexiteers have made such a big deal of fishing, which accounts for a tiny proportion of our economy, they'll just bang on about fish a lot. They will shout and shout and shout again about freedom from the common fisheries policy. Now, in some ways, maybe this is plausible. The EU don't want a no deal either. I sometimes get comments from people, both within this country and in the EU, suggesting, the EU no longer care, they've been preparing anyway, sod off, go and have your hard Brexit. That is not the case at all. It is true that the EU are resigned to a no deal outcome, because what else could happen without Boris Johnson changing his position on something? It's also true that COVID is a far bigger problem than Brexit, so of course that's going to be their main focus. And it is also true that they have been preparing as best they can for a no deal for some time. But a no deal Brexit is still deeply damaging. You can't actually prepare for it. You can mitigate some of the damage. You can't cancel the damage out completely. It affects the UK most of all, but it does also affect other EU countries, and some, the ones closest to us, pretty badly. So if Johnson waited until October, let's say, and then he said, tell you what, I'll agree to our current arrangements, we'll pay into the EU budget, we'll accept the EU rules necessary for frictionless trade, which is not all EU rules. The EU are not even expecting that. We'll opt into the EU systems, we'll defer to the European Court of Justice on disputes. All of it, with one exception, we still want to pull out of the common fisheries policy. We just want to be able to pull out of that, and we'll accept everything else. Now, maybe it's just about possible the EU will go, yeah, all right then. So Boris Johnson would claim his Brexit deal. Most people in the country would think he's done what he said. All the papers would bang on about freedom from the EU, with the emphasis on fishing, which can't be denied, and we could move on from Brexit. There'd be no massive queues at the border post this January, no extra paperwork for businesses to have to complete or hauliers, no reason for businesses, well, the businesses that stayed in the UK, to have to move overseas. All the downsides of Brexit, apart from the ones that have already occurred, would never need really materialise. People like myself would be pointing out that actually what we've got is fundamentally the same as the transition period, but that would be dismissed as sour grapes. Oh, you just don't appreciate that Boris Johnson actually got the deal that you said was impossible. All nice and neat. Except there are a few little issues. So, 1. There are some EU countries that still want an agreement on fishing rights. The agreement is up for negotiation, of course, and could be changed. No one's saying we have to accept the common fishery policy as it exists now. But those countries will still want an agreement. Now, one of these countries is France. And French fishermen, French people in general actually, are not at all shy about causing trouble if they are facing some sort of injustice. They may even cause enough of a fuss to block even this deal. Second, such a deal would, as Adonis himself argues, heavily favour the EU. This is not likely to be ignored by those who are genuinely pro-Brexit. It's all right saying that the vast majority of the country would be fooled by such a deal. Of course they would. In fact, we could have stayed as members of the EU and most of the country wouldn't have noticed if Boris Johnson said we hadn't. But there are people who do pay attention and who are well informed. And a lot of those people are very influential in the Brexit crowd as well. And they are not going to be fooled by it. Third, it would mean agreeing to the level playing field that Boris Johnson has set such store by not following. Now, That also would not suit the disaster capitalists. Not only would it mean they don't get their massive payout from betting on the no deal scenario at the end of this year, but also those pesky tax avoidance rules are here to stay, and they would have to be enforced as well. For, speaking of anti-tax avoidance rules, the first time we're not complying with them, or indeed any other EU rules, we'll be fighting a case in the European Court. That will sort of dispel the notion that we've, as the Brexiteers put it, taken back control. The first time we get told by the European Court of Justice that we've been a naughty boy and we need to sort ourselves out, all of a sudden everyone's turning around going, what's going on? 5. This is the big one for me. Such a deal is completely incompatible with the US trade deal on offer. If we sign up to a US agreement this year, before Trump potentially is gone, that's why there's such a rush for it, then we will be allowing substandard produce into the UK. Now, at this point, the EU can't afford for that produce to get into the EU. At that point, they cannot afford to not have checks on goods passing from the UK to the EU. But if we agree to keep our arrangements with the EU as they are, then the US deal becomes impossible. Now, any one of those is enough to scupper the whole thing. And this is the problem with trying to work out what is likely to happen at the end of the year when crunch time approaches, because when you consider all of the possible outcomes, and this isn't even the only one I'll be discussing this week, there's at least one more tomorrow, every single one of them is either politically or legally impossible. Sometimes both. So I would be wary of speculation that seems to make logical sense when you sort of follow it, because there will always be some other factor that bends it out of shape. But still, there is a possibility that this plan in some form is what happens. We'll just have to keep an eye on what government statements are about Brexit as the year grinds on, and then just reevaluate the options each time and see which one seems to be the more likely. But there it is. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.